I learned to ignore noise long before I learned to trust patterns. The morning my badge stopped opening doors, I knew something had shifted. It didn't flash red. It didn't trigger an alarm. The scanner simply beeped once, polite, almost apologetic, and stayed locked. I tried again. Same sound, same refusal. People passed behind me, distracted, unaware. To them, it was nothing. To me, it was a signal that shouldn't exist. By the time the country started burning, I realized that beep was the first shot. In counterintelligence, chaos is normal. Threats overlap, motives blur, coincidences happen every day. What matters isn't what screams the loudest. It's what repeats quietly. Patterns don't announce themselves. They whisper. And once you've learned how to listen, you can't unhear them. For more than 3 decades, I worked cases that never reached headlines. Financial discrepancies buried under layers of bureaucracy. Intelligence leaks disguised as clerical errors. Groups that appeared overnight with funding that didn't match their public rhetoric. Every major operation I led followed the same rule. If something feels coordinated, it probably is. 2 years before the country began tearing itself apart, I started seeing signals that didn't fit any known model. Groups that publicly despised each other were using the same logistics providers. Online movements preaching opposite ideologies were pushing identical narratives, sometimes within minutes of one another. Media outrage followed with unsettling precision, not reaction, but timing, like cues in a rehearsal. I assumed coincidence, then incompetence. Then I did what I always did. I mapped it. The results tightened something in my chest. This wasn't radicalization. It wasn't political extremism. It wasn't foreign terrorism. It was choreography. Someone wasn't trying to seize power. They were trying to make the system collapse under its own weight. I reran the analysis. Different data sets. Different assumptions. I stripped out every bias I could think of. The conclusion didn't change. The patterns grew sharper. Civil fracture was being engineered, slowly, deliberately, invisibly. When I compiled the report, I kept it clinical. No speculation, no emotion. Just timelines, financial links, escalation curves, probability models. The kind of report I had submitted dozens of times before. The kind that usually triggered task forces and midnight calls. This time, it triggered silence. Deputy Director Halverson didn't interrupt me. He didn't argue. He didn't even flip the pages. When I finished, he closed the folder carefully, leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling as if searching for patience. "You're seeing connections where none exist," he finally said. "The country is polarized. That doesn't mean it's under attack." I pushed back. I showed him capital flows routed through domestic shell structures, defense contractors quietly funding media outlets on opposite extremes. The synchronization between online agitation and real-world unrest. Cities igniting simultaneously with no organic connection. He stood up. "This theory is dangerous," he said quietly. "Not because it's wrong. Because if people believe it, they'll panic." That was the moment everything shifted. They weren't afraid the theory was false. They were afraid it was true. If you've ever felt something was wrong and no one listened, remember where you're watching this from. After that meeting, the changes were subtle enough to deny and obvious enough to feel. My clearance wasn't revoked, just restricted. Requests that once took minutes now took days. Access logs lagged without explanation. Colleagues I'd trusted for years stopped looping me into briefings. Some stopped looking me in the eye. Then came the evaluation. "Routine," they said. "Standard procedure." A psychologist I'd never met asked if I felt isolated. If I believed institutions were failing. If I trusted my own judgment more than consensus. The questions weren't diagnostic. They were strategic. I answered honestly. That was my mistake. 2 weeks later, my cases were reassigned. Officially, it was temporary. Pending review. No accusation. No explanation. Just an email that stripped me of operational authority without ever calling it punishment. That's when I realized something more disturbing than the conspiracy itself. No one was going to stop this. Not because they couldn't, because they wouldn't. and if I stayed silent, I wouldn't just be irrelevant. I would be complicit. So I stepped outside the system. I didn't leak classified documents. I didn't name names. I spoke in probabilities, in risk assessments, in warnings. I framed it as concern, not accusation. A plea, not an attack. The response was immediate and brutal. Headlines mocked me. Commentators questioned my mental stability. Veteran agent pushes conspiracy narrative. Officials dismiss claims of planned civil unrest. Experts question judgment after years in intelligence. Within 48 hours, I was officially placed on administrative leave. Unofficially, my name stopped opening doors. The fallout didn't come quietly. It arrived in laughter first. Bright, confident laughter that spread faster than any correction ever could. Late-night hosts turned my warnings into punchlines. Commentators spoke about career fatigue and pattern obsession, as if decades of experience could suddenly curdle into delusion. A retired professor on a cable panel smiled and said the sentence that followed me for weeks. When you look for monsters long enough, you start seeing them everywhere. My phone stopped ringing. Not all at once. One number at a time. Friends who once trusted me with their lives suddenly needed distance. Colleagues kept conversations short, professional, sterile. Invitations disappeared. The message was clear. Credibility wasn't something you earned forever. It was a badge you wore until someone decided you didn't. I tried going back through official channels one last time. Appeals, internal memos, requests for reconsideration. Every response was polite, professional, empty. The system had decided I was inconvenient. An inconvenience is treated like a virus, isolated before it spreads. That's when the streets started to change. At first, it was subtle. Small protests that escalated too fast. Demonstrations that arrived with supplies already staged. Medical kits, radios, water pallets, food caches. Even portable battery packs stacked like someone expected a long event. I saw people who had never organized anything in their lives suddenly move like they'd rehearsed. They knew where the cameras would be. They knew which intersections to hold. They knew when to disperse before law enforcement could contain them. It wasn't anger. Anger is messy. This was timing. Then came the outages. Localized at first. Power grids failing in clusters. The kind of failure that looks accidental on paper and deliberate in the field. Communication disruptions blamed on routine maintenance. Emergency services overwhelmed in cities that had been calm days earlier. Every time authorities tried to stabilize one area, another hotspot ignited somewhere else, perfectly spaced. Like someone was testing response time and resource limits. I kept watching, taking notes the way I always had, even without a badge. I tracked where the first fires started, where the first roadblocks appeared, where the first rumors went viral. The pattern was there again, quiet, repeating, unmistakable. This wasn't unrest. It was activation. The morning everything broke, my daughter left early. She was 16, old enough to believe the world was mostly fair, young enough to think danger always announced itself. Acting was her escape, her secret door out of a life shaped by my absence and my silence. She carried her script pages everywhere, folded and refolded until the corners softened. She practiced lines in the hallway mirror, tugging her hair back the way she thought professionals did. She had a battered notebook where she wrote notes like a director, tiny observations about emotion, pacing, breath. That day, she had an audition downtown for a small independent film. Low budget, no fame, just a chance. She'd talked about it for weeks, trying to sound casual, but her hands betrayed her, always fidgeting, always smoothing invisible wrinkles in her clothes. In the kitchen, she poured cereal too fast, splashing milk onto the counter. She laughed at herself, wiped it with her sleeve, and looked up at me with a half-smile that made her still feel younger than she wanted to be. "You're picking me up, right?" she asked. I nodded without looking away from my coffee, as if it was an easy promise, as if the world hadn't already started to tilt. "Promise," she insisted, because she'd learned that adults say yes too easily. I met her eyes then. "I promise." She grabbed her bag, the one with the little charm on the zipper, something she'd bought at a street market because it looked lucky. She paused at the doorway, turned back, and held up her notebook like a trophy. "If I get it," she said, trying not to sound hopeful, "I'm making you come to set. You don't get to hide forever." "I'll be there," I said. She rolled her eyes, smiling. "That's not what I said." Then she was gone, headphones on, disappearing into a world she still believed she could negotiate with talent and charm. By noon, the city was unrecognizable. The first sirens cut through the air like blades, then another, until the sound became constant, less an alarm and more a wounded animal that couldn't stop crying. Smoke rose from multiple neighborhoods at once. Traffic lights flickered, then died. The streets filled with people moving fast, not in one direction but in waves, pushed by rumors nobody could confirm. Social media flooded with narratives designed like weapons, videos edited to look like proof, claims engineered to enrage different groups simultaneously. Every headline felt like gasoline. Every rumor felt like a match. Roads were blocked, police lines fractured. Armed civilians appeared where no one expected them, moving with the confidence of people who believed they'd been preparing for this all their lives. I got in my car and drove toward downtown, ignoring barricades, ignoring orders, ignoring the part of my brain that kept saying the same thing over and over. "This is too coordinated, too clean." The audition building was still standing. That's what made it worse. Inside, the lobby was empty. No receptionist, no casting assistant, no nervous teenagers clutching folded pages. The lights were on, but the building felt paused like it had been left mid-breath. The air carried a faint smell of stale coffee mixed with something metallic, the kind of smell you only notice when adrenaline sharpens your senses. I called her name. No answer. I moved past the waiting area and into the hallway, my footsteps echoing too loudly on the tile. Every door I checked made it worse. Not because there were signs of violence, but because there weren't. Chairs were neatly aligned. A water cooler hummed quietly. A poster for a film released the previous year peeled at the corners, untouched. Too normal. I climbed the stairs two at a time, heart punching against my ribs. On the second floor, a door to one of the audition rooms stood slightly ajar. Inside, a chair faced the wall where a camera had been mounted. The red recording light was off. Then I saw it. Her phone, placed neatly on a chair in the waiting room upstairs. Not dropped, not forgotten, not tossed aside. Placed, charged, undamaged, silent. I stared at it for a long moment, and something inside me went cold. Because this wasn't chaos. Chaos leaves mess. This was intention, wrapped in a small rectangle of glass. I picked it up and tried unlocking it. The screen lit instantly. No cracks. No scratches. A notification pulsed at the top, one I had never seen on a civilian device before. System access attempt. Session terminated. I checked the timestamp. 11:47 a.m., 3 minutes before the first citywide outage. I tried calling her. No signal. I tried connecting to the building's Wi-Fi. The network existed, but authentication failed. Then I noticed something else. Every available camera feed in the building showed the same error message. Timestamp data corrupted. Not missing. Overwritten. That was the moment panic gave way to clarity. She hadn't been taken randomly. She was a message. I forced myself to slow down. Hospitals, shelters, emergency intake lists. I made calls to people who still answered out of habit before remembering they weren't supposed to. Nothing. No record of her arrival anywhere. No eyewitness accounts. No ambulance logs. When I accessed the city's traffic cameras along her route, I found clean gaps where footage should have existed. Not glitches, gaps. The kind you get when someone manually purges data and replaces it with a loop so short it looks like continuity to anyone not trained to notice. Foreign actors don't do that. They disrupt, they overwhelm, they leave fingerprints. This was removal. Clean, quiet, bureaucratic. This wasn't retaliation for going public. This was containment. They weren't punishing me for what I'd said. They were neutralizing me for what I knew. And that meant one thing. I wasn't chasing an enemy across borders. I was standing inside the border, and the border was standing inside me. That night the system closed in. Not with sirens or agents at my door, but with silence. My bank cards stopped working first. I stood at a gas station watching the screen flash, declined again and again while the clerk pretended not to notice. Minutes later, my secure email locked me out. Then my phone displayed a message I'd seen only once before in my career, and never directed at me. Access suspended pending review. By midnight, my credentials were dead. I wasn't fired, I wasn't arrested, I was erased from the category of people who mattered. That's when I understood the difference between being a suspect and being a liability. Suspects are questioned, liabilities are contained. I went home just long enough to grab cash, a jacket, and the old field kit I'd promised myself I'd never need again. As I stepped outside, I noticed a car idling across the street with its lights off. It didn't follow when I pulled away, it didn't need to. They weren't chasing me yet. They were watching. I stopped thinking like an agent trying to fix something and started thinking like a man who needed to survive long enough to find his daughter. Burner phones, back roads, places no one checked anymore because they were too boring to matter. Closed motels, storage facilities, a half-forgotten parking structure beneath a defunct transit project. I slept in short bursts, waking at every unfamiliar sound, replaying the image of her phone on that chair until it felt carved into the back of my eyes. In the quiet hours before dawn, I went back to the data. Containment always leaves a financial shape. You can hide people, but you can't hide money forever, not if it moves through systems designed to be audited by people like me. I reached out to old contacts who still owed me favors they couldn't publicly acknowledge. Retired analysts, contractors pushed out years earlier. People who had learned the hard way that loyalty to the institution didn't guarantee protection from it. The pattern emerged slowly, then all at once. Emergency funds rerouted through domestic entities with no operational footprint. Infrastructure investments approved, funded, and then quietly abandoned without explanation. Properties listed as inactive, then inexplicably maintained. Power bills paid. Network access renewed. Security contracts extended year after year under threat assessments that were never declassified because they were never real. One line item stopped me cold. A government-owned property marked as decommissioned 6 years earlier. No public employees assigned, no declared purpose. Yet it received regular payments for power, data connectivity, and contracted security services, always just under the threshold that triggered automatic review. It officially didn't exist anymore. But it was very much alive. I drove past it the next afternoon, staying far enough away to look like just another commuter rerouted by closures. From a distance, it looked exactly like the record said it was, a neglected concrete complex with faded signage and cracked pavement. But the details betrayed the lie. Cameras that were too new. Vehicles rotating on irregular schedules. Guards who didn't wear standard uniforms and never used the same entrance twice. This wasn't a black site. It was a buffer. A place designed to exist in the gray space between legality and secrecy, close enough to government protection to be untouchable, distant enough to be deniable. Inside that building, I knew one thing with a certainty that hurt. My daughter wasn't there because of who she was. She was there because of who I was. The realization hollowed something in my chest. For the first time, fear wasn't abstract or professional. It wasn't something I could manage with training or distance. It was raw and immediate. I wondered what they had told her, what version of me they had painted, whether she believed any of it. I couldn't let them define me for her. I didn't rush the building. That was the instinct they expected. Desperation, recklessness, noise. Facilities like that are designed to punish impulse. Instead, I watched. I counted guard rotations. I noted which doors were used during shift changes and which weren't. I listened to radio chatter drifting through unsecured frequencies, the kind people stop worrying about when they believe no one dangerous is listening. The entry point wasn't a door. It was paperwork. Facilities that live in the shadows rely on outdated systems because modernization creates visibility. Legacy software leaves blind spots. Blind spots create opportunity. I spent an entire night rebuilding an access sequence from memory, hands shaking as I typed on a salvaged laptop, powered by a generator that growled like it resented being woken. When the override finally accepted the code, I didn't feel relief. I felt dread, because now there was no turning back. I entered at dawn, dressed like maintenance personnel responding to a fabricated infrastructure alert. No weapon visible, no aggression. Just another man doing a job no one wanted to question during a national crisis. The first door accepted the credential. The second hesitated, then unlocked with a muted click that sounded far too loud in the quiet corridor. Inside, the building smelled sterile and wrong, too clean for a country unraveling outside its walls. The hum of systems echoed through empty corridors, steady and indifferent, like a heart that refused to notice the patient was dying. Fluorescent lights cast a flat glow that erased shadows, the kind of lighting used to make faces unreadable on camera. I recognized details most people would miss. The hinges on the doors, reinforced to handle secured transport. The rounded corridor corners designed for gurneys and containment carts. The language on internal signage, acronyms phased out publicly years ago but never truly retired. This wasn't improvised. This was institutional. On the third level, a guard glanced up as I passed, eyes lingering for half a second too long. I kept my pace steady. People expect nervousness. They rarely expect confidence. The radio on his shoulder crackled with a calm voice issuing a routine status check. No alarms. Not yet. I followed the layout I had reconstructed in my head 100 times. Turn left, where the cameras overlapped. Pause where the blind spot widened. Swipe where the system lagged. The override bought me minutes. Maybe less. Then I saw her. She was sitting on a chair with her hands folded in her lap, trying to look calm the way she did before auditions. Her script notebook rested against her leg, the corners worn soft. When she looked up and saw me, her eyes widened, and for a terrifying moment I thought she wouldn't recognize me. Then she stood so fast, the chair tipped backward and clattered against the wall. "They told me you wouldn't come," she said. I crossed the room and held her, feeling how real she was, how warm, how fragile. For a second, the building disappeared. The chaos outside disappeared. There was only the familiar weight of her head against my shoulder and the quiet realization that I was still in time. "They said you were dangerous," she added, her voice small now. "They said you cared more about being right than about me." I opened my mouth to answer, and that's when the alarms started. They didn't scream. They whispered, a low, controlled tone that meant only one thing to people trained to hear it: internal breach, protocol escalation, containment failure. Doors locked behind us with a heavy finality. Lights dimmed. Red indicators pulsed along the ceiling like a measured heartbeat. They had let me get this far. Now they wanted to see how I would leave. We moved fast, not running. Running attracts attention, but with the purposeful urgency of people who knew exactly where they were going. A service corridor led to a stairwell that shouldn't have existed, its access panel hidden behind a removable wall section installed for reasons no longer documented. I'd found it in an old schematic that had been mislabeled twice and archived under the wrong project code. As we descended, voices crackled over the internal channels. Calm, efficient. The tone of people managing a drill, not a human life. I recognized one voice immediately. Deputy Director Halverson. "Do not pursue," he said. "Contain and observe. Contain and observe." They didn't expect me to die in that building. They expected me to run, to expose myself, to make mistakes, to lead them to anyone who still believed me. Using my daughter hadn't just been leverage, it was bait. We exited through an emergency corridor that wasn't on any map I'd ever seen and emerged into the gray light of morning. Outside, the city roared with distant chaos. Sirens, engines, the low thunder of a population on edge, unaware of how close it had come to something far worse. I didn't stop moving until we were somewhere no surveillance system bothered with anymore. Only then did I sit down. Only then did I breathe. Only then did I accept the truth. This wasn't the end of the conspiracy. It was the beginning of the exposure. I didn't take her home. Home was the first place they would search. Not because it made sense, but because systems always begin with the obvious. Instead, I drove until the city thinned into neglected industrial zones, and then farther, to a stretch of land owned by a federal program that no longer existed on paper. It had been abandoned decades earlier, never sold because no one could agree on jurisdiction. Bureaucratic limbo has a way of becoming invisible. She slept almost immediately, exhaustion overtaking fear. I stayed awake listening to the wind scrape against rusted metal outside, counting seconds between distant sounds, cataloging each one like evidence. When dawn came, I turned on a muted television. The unrest hadn't slowed. It had matured. Officials were no longer denying the chaos. They were reframing it. Language shifted subtly but decisively. Domestic stabilization. Temporary emergency authority. Coordinated response. Words designed to sound responsible while quietly expanding power. What would have sparked outrage weeks earlier was now being discussed calmly, even gratefully, by a frightened public. Exactly as planned. I organized everything I had ignored before, the pieces I'd been too cautious to connect publicly. Financial ledgers tied to political families that appeared nowhere near intelligence work. Military contracts funneled through private firms whose board members rotated seamlessly into government advisory roles. Intelligence directives rewritten just enough to create legal gray zones where accountability evaporated. I requested a meeting. Halverson agreed. We met in a secure location under the pretense of damage control. Neutral walls, neutral lighting, neutral language. He didn't deny anything, not the manipulation, not the emergency authorities, not the facility where my daughter had been held. "This is bigger than you," he said, hands folded, voice calm, almost paternal. "The country needs to be reshaped before it tears itself apart." "How many people have to suffer for that reshaping?" I asked. He didn't answer. That silence told me everything. There was no coup coming. The coup had already happened. Slowly, legally, invisibly. They assumed I would disappear quietly, as discredited men often do, that I would choose safety for my daughter over truth for a country that had already moved on without me. They were wrong. I didn't leak the story. I detonated it. I bypassed traditional media entirely. A live national broadcast streamed across multiple platforms simultaneously. Documents queued for release in real time. Names, financial trails, internal memos, recordings, cross-referenced and mirrored across servers outside domestic jurisdiction. They tried to stop it. Power flickered. The feed dropped, then reconnected. A forced update attempted to lock my system midstream. On a secondary monitor, a warning flashed. Unauthorized access detected. I heard vehicles outside, engines idling too close for coincidence. My daughter woke to raised voices and stood in the doorway, eyes wide. If I run, I told myself, we disappear. If I speak, we become targets. I pressed send. The broadcast went live. I spoke calmly, clearly, not as a man seeking revenge, but as someone with nothing left to protect except the truth. I explained the orchestration, the incentives, the endgame. I showed how chaos had been manufactured, how fear had been cultivated, how emergency power had been positioned as salvation. The reaction was immediate. Markets froze. Officials resigned. Others denied everything until the evidence buried them in real time. Some tried to flee. Some were detained. Some vanished into the same shadows they had used for years. The country didn't collapse that day. But it didn't remain whole either. Trust doesn't survive revelations like that. Institutions staggered. Allies questioned everything. Enemies watched carefully, measuring what a wounded superpower still had left. In the weeks that followed, investigations multiplied, committees formed, emergency measures were rolled back in public while quietly preserved in private. The machinery adapted. It always does. My daughter tried to return to her life. School resumed. Friends asked questions they didn't know how to finish. She watched the news differently now, listening not just to what was said but to what was avoided. There was no return for me, no reinstatement, no apology, no quiet retirement with honors. I was offered protection, not safety, just distance, a suggestion to stay out of sight, out of conversation, out of history. I declined, because what haunted me wasn't what I had done, it was what nearly happened. No foreign army crossed our borders, no missiles fell from the sky. The threat wore suits, spoke in measured tones, and filed the right paperwork. And for a long time, almost no one noticed. I used to believe loyalty meant obedience. Now I understand it means resistance when it matters most. If I had stayed quiet, the country might still look stable on the surface. But underneath, something essential would have kept rotting, guided by people who believed they were entitled to decide the future in secret. Exposure didn't fix everything, but it stopped the lie from becoming permanent. And sometimes that's the only victory available. The greatest threat to a nation isn't chaos. It's the moment when good people decide that silence is safer than truth.
So, that's the end of this story, but there are plenty of other great ones right here. Before you go, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring that little bell.